Hi everyone, I'm Siobhan Milner and this is Total Performance, a podcast dedicated to all things athletic performance and injury prevention. Join me and my guests as we explore the many aspects that come together to build our total performance picture. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, today I'm speaking to Tommy about jump training and plyometric training for athletes. We talk a little bit about the difference between the two because they are different. Plyometric training is not the same as just jumping. We also talk a little bit about different jumping styles and how that might affect how we train. We also talk about the fact that you need a strong foundation first before focusing on explosive capabilities, because as we know, power is force times velocity. So if we want to be powerful, we got to be strong as well. And we also talk a little bit about different training strategies depending on our season, whether or not we're less experienced or a more experienced athlete. And we talk about jump training and plyometric training for athletes who are not in traditional jumping sports. So we talk a little bit about things like cross country and running and how other sports in general can benefit from plyometric and jump style training. Welcome, Tommy. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. As I said, I've been traveling a little bit for work, so I'm a little tired, but I'm excited to be chatting with you today.
Well, and thanks for having me on. I always love to be on different things like this and have the chance to interact and, connect with other coaches and sport practitioners from around the world. So it's always a fun time. So thank you for having me, and I'm excited to be here.
Oh, you're very welcome. So we're going to talk a little bit about jump training today and also plyometrics. So do you mind starting us off? Because I know when I speak to athletes, but also coaches, they have an idea of what they think jump training is or how you might train for jumping. And often when I say the word plyometrics, they don't actually realize that this could be something different to just jumps in general. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between the two?
Yeah. So for me, especially coming from a kind of blended strength and track and field background, when I think of plyometrics, I think of Verkhoshansky and all the work that went on in the 60s, Russian high jump coach. And they used this plyometric training, because that was the term that they coined it, was an alternative to sport specific training, because at certain times of the year they couldn't high jump outside or do different jump activities. So they looked at the contact times and how long they apply force in a high jump or a long jump or things like that. And then they tried to create or find substitutes where they would apply jump type force in that same time frame. And so one of the big elements of that was dropping from some kind of free fall, or having an element where you were free falling from a elevated surface or from a previous jump, and then having to land, interact with the ground, and then propel yourself back up. So to me, a plyometric movement has to have that free fall, interact with the ground, and then react to the ground and come back up or forward or whichever direction you're jumping, where jump training doesn't necessarily have to have that reactive component. I could be standing on the ground, load up, keep both feet on the ground, and then jump as high as I could to do a vertical jump test or jump onto a box. So to me, the big difference between plyometric training and jump training in the way that I prescribe it is that ground contact time, or that time in which you're interacting and reacting to the ground.
So when we're talking about this free fall, I feel like there's a lot of athletes that'll be familiar with depth jumps and drop jumps, but also when we're talking plyometrics, there's also, it's not a free fall, but we have that same reaction when it's just the things like the little leaps in place or little bounds and stuff like that. So that would still fall into that plyometric category rather than your max height takeoff where you're reaching for something right away.
Yeah, in my case, yeah, because I figure whether the athlete, my guess, I don't know for sure because I wasn't around back then. My guess is they were doing stuff from a free fall off the boxes, knowing how the old school, you know, Eastern Bloc training was all sort of sports science based. I'm guessing they were using the box heights to keep track of, oh, if we come off of a 2-foot box or a 3-foot, or so that way everything was kind of tracked and measured. Where for me, I go, okay, well, whether we're moving off of a elevated surface or whether we're, doing repetitive hurdle hops, we're still up in the air and then coming down and interacting with the ground. So I don't have it down to such a sports science. Every training session is not a laboratory research type thing. So I'm guessing that's why a lot of that stuff was done off of boxes, was to quantify everything. But to me, a free fall movement is a free fall movement, whether you're, coming off of a previous jump or dropping or, jumping off of a box.
And when it comes to either styles of training or combining both, if we're doing plyometric or if we're doing jump style training, how would an athlete decide what they wanted to incorporate, or if they needed to incorporate some more of the plyos or some more of the max jump? So maybe it's a good idea to kind of think about a case study or something. So maybe an athlete that is really, as you know, I'm quite interested obviously with beach volleyball, but
Yeah.
maybe an athlete like a volleyball player who's trying to increase their maximum jump height. And of course, we've got things like blocking where it's kind of from a relatively stopped position, or we've got the spiking where they come into it. How would an athlete decide, okay, this is what I need to look at to improve that jump height?
Yeah. So if I draw on some of the previous experience I had with basketball, one of the first things I noticed when I was working a lot with basketball was the style of jumping that different athletes used. And I never played basketball growing up. My sporting background is more track and field, played a little bit of American football, a lot of ultimate frisbee. So sports that are not really basketball at all. But when I was watching basketball for the first time, noticing the outside players, the guards outside of the court, making a lot more 1 foot movements, kind of bounding actions. They're coming into positions to either defend or attack the rim with momentum going off of 1 foot. But then you watch some of the bigger athletes, the centers, the power forwards, the ones that are playing inside the paint, close to the rim. They're in a 2 foot position, boxing out or trying to prevent the box out, and then making some sort of pivot move and attacking or defending the rim off of 2 feet. So, and if you watch somebody do a maximal height jump with an approach, some people will take off of 2 feet, some people will take off of 1. So one of the things I find fascinating is, are people 1 foot or 2 foot jumpers? Because not all the time, but typically what I've seen is the 1 foot jumpers are a little more ballistic, a little more dynamic. They depend on having some momentum, and then they're very good at transferring the momentum. In this case, usually a horizontal movement or a forward action, and then transforming that into a vertical or upward movement. As where some of the 2 foot jumpers, these are usually bigger, more powerful, force driven people, and they do a really good job on 2 feet, loading up and almost like muscling into the jump, so to speak. They're really powerful, really, really strong. And so that was kind of my first time seeing, okay, people jumping different, because coming from track, you jump off of 1 foot. Pretty sure in high jump, you have to take off of 1 foot. They won't allow you to take off of 2. You'll get fouled for that. And then in long jump and triple jump, you approach and take off of 1 foot. So hadn't really given much thought to the 1 foot, 2 foot jumping until I got into the team sport area. So to me, that would be one of the first things when you watch film of you playing the game, or, pay some attention. Are you more of a 1 foot or a 2 foot jumper? Because that might give you some insight onto how you need to train to better perform. And in some cases, you might need to do both. Like you said, in volleyball, a blocking jump, a little more 2 foot, standing there squared up to the net, jumping and blocking. On like a spike, you might have a little bit more, degrees of freedom or different ways that you could do it. Your setup might be taking off of 2 feet or might be taking off of 1. So you have some kind of leeway there. So I don't know if that kind of answers the question, but to me, the 1 foot versus 2 foot jumper kind of tells me the skill set that someone has and what they like to do, or their movement preference. And then we can train accordingly to make sure that you're going to get better at the style of jump you either need or prefer to use.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, especially for athletes or coaches that are either just starting out or maybe don't have access to a team to assess them and watch them as well. Because so if we're saying like the 1 footers tend to be more reactive, more elastic, and then the 2 footers tend to be more strength dominant, I wonder, how would you recommend that an athlete would decide, if they keep honing that particular skill that they're good at, or if they go, okay, actually I need to fill in the gap because I'm more reactive, so I should work more on the strength side. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what jump tests maybe you do with your volleyball squads. I know with basketball, kind of the traditional, 2 foot, feet glued to the ground, load up, touch the veins or touch the wall or whatever it is you're reaching for, kind of a standard up down type jump, which to me again is a jump. It's not a plyometric. So the force strength kind of created athletes will do really well in that. And then you can have sort of an approach jump where you're allowed to run into the jump and then take off and reach as high as you can. So looking at kind of the gap between the two, I know I've worked with athletes before that, you load them up on 2 feet, they explode, they jump and touch 35 inches. And then you give them a running approach and they touch 35 inches. Right. So that tells me, okay, that person's probably very strong, very powerful, good at creating that 2 foot style jumping, but maybe doesn't have the elastic or the reactive capabilities to be a 1 foot or running jumper. So maybe we have to address that. Or you get vice versa. You have someone who's, watch them do the counter movement jump, they only hit like, 20 something. That's not very good. And then you give them a little bit of space to run into it. And all of a sudden they're up there touching 40 inches or something like that. And they just have this ability to take off. So that's maybe one of the easiest or the most accessible ways to kind of look at it without technology is, how easily can you vertically get up somewhere if you have a kind of a standing or stationary jump versus a jump with some sort of momentum or movement going into it.
We do obviously a lot of testing ourselves, and one of the things we'll do is we'll do reactive strength index through things like the 10-5s, the pogo jumps. But if we're looking for something really accessible, I just wonder if you've heard of this app. I think it's called My Jump. I haven't used it, but apparently it's free. I just wondered if you knew, because I know you can just film and you can actually get ground contact times from that. So maybe that's also something interesting.
So, that would be a super accessible way too for people to figure out more that, are you strong enough? Are you powerful enough? And then are you reactive enough? And then you figure out, do you have kind of the base level or foundational physical or athletic qualities to do what you need to do? And then, how well do you transfer those abilities into your, call it your jump specific movements? Because some of those general training things that could help you with 1 or 2 foot jumping that you do in the weight room or supplemental training could look very different than the jumping activity you do, but still have benefit.
Yeah, actually, I'd love if you would talk a little bit more about the weight room side as well, because I think, especially with some of the athletes I work with, when they come to me and they're in like talent development programs and things, one of the things they often say to me is like, oh yeah, but I can't get too strong or I can't get too big because I need to be able to jump. I need to be powerful. So what would you say to an athlete that said something like that? And what would your approach be in the weight room?
Yeah. So my approach in the weight room is, I guess, a little more linear in the sense of I work with a lot of varsity or collegiate level athletes. So kind of like you mentioned, a lot of times I'm getting first year athletes, especially in the sport of athletics or track and field, where they do a lot of the sport, but they don't do a lot of lifting necessarily. So I get people, like you said, they've never lifted. So kind of going through the continuum of, are we strong enough? Are we powerful enough? And then can we be as reactive as possible in that linear kind of fashion? And we have some loose metrics around what is strong enough and what is powerful enough. And then I don't think there should, or we want to have a limit on reactivity. The more explosive and ballistic we can be, that's going to make us better at our sport. So if we can kind of achieve those things. So I don't know if there's such thing as too strong for your sport, but what I will say is that there's a point of diminishing returns. So that's where I kind of get to the point of, are we strong enough? And for, the classic back squat, I sort of live in the world of that 1.6 to 2.0 times body weight squat to be sort of strong enough. If you want to be power lifter strong, the amount of time and effort you would have to put in to creating a 3 times body weight squat probably isn't worth it, because you should be spending more time becoming more powerful or more ballistic to improve your jump. So I don't think there is a strong enough, or like a too strong, but I think there's a what's the point of diminishing returns, and that number is, sort of a loose guideline. I have a lot of athletes that the hip thrust is their big lower body movement, so maybe that's a 2.5 to 3 times body weight. There's conversions. Alex Natera has some great stuff on converting 2-foot squatting ability to 1 foot. So if you want to figure out, oh, am I in that 1.6 to 2.0, body weight back squat range, you can convert some of those things off of a split squat or a rear foot elevated or a single leg squat. So a lot of ways to kind of convert those numbers over. And then with the, are you powerful enough, watts per kilo? So, there's some conversions out there for, body weight and jump height. And then that gives you a watt per kilo. We're very fortunate enough where we have a number of Kaiser machines, which spit out the power number directly at you after every rep. So for us, it's, very feasible to figure out the power numbers, but you can do it other ways with jump tests. If you know your body weight and how high you've jumped, then you can figure out kind of watts per kilo. And, in our population, if we're somewhere between 35 to 45 watts per kilo, those are usually pretty explosive athletes. There are world-class athletes that are capable of, 55, 60 plus watts per kilo, which is just a wildly high number. But those are some kind of loose guidelines where I go, okay, if you've never lifted before or never trained outside of your sport, can we achieve some of these numbers? Because that can give us insight to whether it's maybe more of a technical element that we need to work on to make you jump higher, or is it a physical or athletic ability? Because if you've never lifted, well, we don't know if you're strong enough or powerful enough. So let's get you there and then see what gaps we have in our training.
Yeah, this is quite interesting, because I was actually just having a conversation with a colleague last week about one of the things I have been thinking about is there too strong, or is there just we've dedicated all of our time to strength training and we're not actually hitting the plyometrics and we're not actually hitting the conditioning? Like, we've kind of shifted the focus too far to the weight room. Whereas if you are still touching all of those other qualities that you need for your sport, is there such a thing as too strong? It's something I'm wondering, because I recently, oh gosh, I can't remember his name. There's a guy in Denmark who's a sports scientist, but he's also a high jump coach. And
Okay.
He was showing us a ton of the numbers for his elite level high jumpers that he works with. And, they were doing reactive hang cleans with 2 times body weight. And I was like, okay, this is one of they have to fly, they have to go high. And these are one of the ones that if you saw that weight on the bar, this is exactly what I think some athletes would be like, oh, too heavy, but it's not diminishing their potential, So yeah, interesting to think about.
Yeah, like I said, that's a little bit the way I look at it. I think the easiest examples for me are, being a background of sprints. If you think of someone exiting the blocks, a lot of demands of maximal strength and how much heavy weight can you move, because you have a little more time to apply your force. Then if you're, upright, running as fast as you possibly can, super reactive, you have to be on and off the ground in less than 1/10 of a second, even faster if you're hurdling. And so you have a very small window of time to apply your force. And then in between that's where it blends from kind of strength into more power and then into more reactive. So if I have a first year athlete who comes in and then I go, we need to, let's say we need to work on everything because they've never trained before. Well, if they become strong enough and they start squatting the house or hip thrusting, a small car or something like that, and they still struggle to get out of the blocks. Now I go, okay, well, they're strong enough. This is probably a technical thing. Maybe I need to change their setup position. I need to maybe change the coaching analogies I'm using, something like that, to help them do the movement more efficiently or the way they're supposed to. But if they're not exiting the blocks really well and they're not strong enough, then I'm not sure, well, I could coach them up all day, but we might just need to get stronger, and vice versa. So that can be, I think, what I had alluded to earlier about, can we figure out what's the root cause of, maybe the performance gap, or how do we improve it, is Okay, well, if you're strong enough and powerful enough, it makes it easy for us to go, okay, we've checked those boxes. Now, if we haven't seen the improvement in sprinting, jumping, agility, change of direction, whatever it is, now we can sort of start to process of elimination, figure out some of the other avenues we would need to go in our training.
You were mentioning with the hurdles how there's these really short ground contact times. And this is one of the other things that I've also spoken to you about, because, of course, I'm working with a sport that is on sand. And then there's going to
Yeah.
be totally different contact times again, because, of course, the surface moves. So, how can these different ground contact times be relevant to the training that the athletes should be focusing on if they want to enhance their performance?
So if we look at does the contact time match the force application time, basically in the weight room? So if I do a super heavy, maximal lower body movement, and it takes me 2 or 3 seconds to get through the movement, I'm applying a lot of force in a long window of time. So if we go back to the sort of the jump test examples, yeah, if I'm standing on the ground, both my feet stay planted and I load up and then explode and come back up, I virtually have not unlimited amounts of time, but if I want to spend a little more time on the ground to put force into the ground, I'm able to do that. There's no time constraints. Whereas if I'm trying to 1 foot jump, or if I'm sprinting, for example, I'm in a race. If I spend 3 seconds on the ground, I'm going to get left behind. So if we need to apply the force in a very short amount of time, so again, that could be sprinting. A team sport example would be I got to react to the ball or an opponent or something that's going on. And if I spend too long, I get left behind or out of position. So if we have a very small amount of time to apply the force, then we want to work on things in the weight room where we apply our force, or we're performing the movement as fast as possible or with minimal time on the ground and sort of everything in between. So I don't know if that kind of answers what you're looking for, but to me, if you have a lot of time to apply your force, then if you do things where you have a lot of time to apply force, that's more specific, so to speak. But if you are in sporting environments where you have limited time to apply your force, then the most specific way you can focus your time training is on jump or plyometric training that emphasizes a small amount of time you have to apply your force.
Yeah, and I think athletes probably intuitively understand that longer time to apply force, that could also be kind of your standard lifting, your back squat and things as well. But we also spoke about how Olympic lifting can fall into that category compared to something like a depth jump or something that's going to be super, super reactive.
Yeah, so I put the Olympic lift, like the snatch, clean, things like that, almost in a bit of a middle ground. Bar velocity on snatch is a little higher, and we tend not to lift as much with snatch because we got to go overhead in a wide position. So you can sometimes see faster periods of time to apply the force because it's a lighter bar, it's going to move quicker. But if you have like a super heavy clean, like your maximal clean, you're trying to maximize the length of time that you can apply force in the pull as you're getting the bar moving up. So something like a very heavy clean is probably closer to like you said, that traditional strength end. And, maybe something like a very light split snatch is almost a little bit more on I wouldn't say reactive because there's not a reactive component, but it's a little more that small window of time to apply your force. And then sort of that to me would be the gradient that you're kind of working on. So a lighter, faster Olympic lift skews you a little bit more towards the small contact time, but a big, heavy Olympic lift skews you more towards that really long contact time. So that's where you might see somebody wants to be a 1 foot jumper and, touch 40 plus inches on a vertical jump. And if all you do is squat and clean really heavy, you haven't actually been able to take advantage of your ability to apply force in a really small period of time, which might be beneficial to improving that jump. Or vice versa, if you don't get any stronger, then your 2 foot standard kind of counter movement jump maybe won't improve as much as you were hoping because you haven't trained the ability to apply force in that specific window of time.
And so for athletes, if they're thinking about some of the stuff that they're going to be doing in their own training and in the gym, and of course, in an ideal world, they have access to strength and conditioning coaches, but especially when they're, at the grassroots level, or they're not in selection, they don't always. Would you recommend that they're still, touching both ends? So they're still doing the heavy strength, they're still doing kind of the power stuff, they're still doing the reactive stuff? Or do you recommend that they really look at what their sport is and they get more specific?
That probably depends on the age of the athlete. If there's someone who hasn't specialized in one particular sport, then I would say, kind of touch on a little bit of everything. Leave your options open. Don't become too narrow focused too soon. If this is someone who's a little bit older and kind of specific to one event area or one sport or one position within a sport, then you probably, can then narrow the focus to what do I need to be really good at for my sport, and put kind of more eggs in that basket, so to speak. Could also, if you don't have strength and conditioning guidance, there might be guidance you can get from, your sport coach, not in terms of what to exactly do in the weight room, unless they're, qualified and have experience with that. That can be someone to lean on. But if they, a basketball player who, you're a lot taller than you were, someone who's maybe 17, 18 and still growing. And we think you're going to switch from, a guard to a big, you're going to play the 4 or the 5, be a center. Then maybe you need to now, okay, well, if I'm going to be in the paint, I might be doing more 2-foot jumping. So maybe I should gear my training towards that. Or, a basketball player who, had hopes of being really tall and has not grown all that much. And now it's like, okay, I got to play guard. So now you start to emphasize on that. You might be able to get some insight from your coaches in terms of where your deficits are in the game, or where they see your role on the court or the field or whatever surface you play on being most effective. Because that might also give you some insight to, okay, I'm going to have to do a lot of these types of things in that position. So I need to be more, ballistic. I'm going to have a small window of time to apply my force. Oh, this position, I'll have a larger window of time to apply my force. So I might, need to shift things towards that. So you might be able to talk to the coaching staff as well and get some insight for your training as well, based on where they see you fitting in on the team and the role that you would play.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point as well about the training age of the athlete, because especially in the beginning, I think it's interesting because it's often in the beginning when they're newer to strength training and conditioning as well. But strength and plyometrics, all of these things that they think they've got to do the super fancy specific stuff. But that's where I'm usually focusing on building a base. But as you may have already guessed as well, I'm quite a fan of general physical preparedness, like trying to touch all qualities all the time. So I think it's also a question of where you are in the season as well, for how specific you want to get for a lot of these qualities too.
Absolutely. And, to early on in training where competition's not a focus, really great opportunity to focus on are you strong enough? Are you powerful enough? And build sort of that, like you said, that foundation, those general qualities to build upon. And then as you get into more specific focus of the year in competition, now you can, okay, we touch strength once in a while to keep it up. We touch power once in a while to keep it up. But maybe the emphasis is, on shorter contact times, or again, depending on, what you do, maybe you touch the ballistic small window of time stuff every once in a while. And there's more emphasis on strength or power, depending on, what it is you're doing. So yeah, I completely agree with that. I think in early on, you have more time to build the base and go after sort of that traditional, strong enough, powerful enough, reactive enough. And then in season or in the competitive phase, you can start to touch on things sparingly that you just need to stay in touch with, and then put more emphasis on the things that are going to have the most direct transfer to your sport performance.
With the athletes you're working with, do you have some athletes that have really long, dense competition seasons, or do you usually have them that they've really got, okay, competitions here, then we've got a bit of time to go away and train again, competitions here? Do you know what I mean? Because I think this also affects when we decide if we're going to do something like, I think in some sports, for example, block periodization is not feasible, because if I only did that with their certain competition schedules, then it really would be a long time that we don't touch certain physical qualities.
Yeah, it's a little different for us. So for the speed power athletes, we typically kind of have 2 seasons. So in Canada, we don't have a outdoor track and field or athletic season collegiately. That's all done through clubs. So the university or college system only competes indoor. So we have sort of September, October, November, part of December to really as a preparation period where we could do something a little more blocked, like, hey, 4 or 5 weeks, we're going after strength. 4 or 5 weeks, we're going after power. Then we have our indoor season. Then we have a little bit of time to prepare before going into kind of June, July, August for the outdoor season. So for jumpers, sprinters, hurdlers, throwers, athletes like that, you do get a little more, prep time, so to speak. On the endurance or the distance end, it becomes a little trickier, because to help with numbers, our long and middle distance athletes for indoor also compete in the fall for cross country. And then they compete outdoor, and then some of them do road run. So you end up with potentially 3 or 4 seasons, so to speak, in the year. So there's very minimal time. They compete in cross country September, October, and I think cross country nationals is somewhere the first week in November. And then all of a sudden we're in the exam period in December, and then January rolls around, we're competing indoor. So, and then we finish in March for indoor, and then, you kind of have April, which is again when we have exams, and then we go into the outdoor season. So for some of the speed power athletes, we can emphasize a little bit more blocked focus. And I'm a little bit more confident working with that type of system too, because I can better see, sprinting and hurdling and know, okay, this person, we need to work a little bit more on this. We need to work a little bit more on that. Or like I alluded to before, is it a, athletic or physical quality detriment, or is it a technical detriment? So I'm a little more confident because we have both the time and I have a better understanding of the event, as where with, cross country, middle distance, the endurance athletes, we sort of have to touch on everything just a little bit here and there, kind of all the time, because there's not really a true, very, very small amounts of the year do we get dedicated sort of off season time where we can go after, kind of blocked or really focused training. So I don't know if that answers the question. Everyone's going to have different demands that they're dealing with, but those are kind of the two scenarios that I deal with in, working in collegiate sport in Canada with track and field.
Yeah, I think it's just interesting for both athletes and coaches to hear, because I think what often happens is when we're hearing people talking about how they do things, we're not necessarily thinking about, okay, this is the sport they're working with, this is the context, this is the demands, and we're just hearing like, oh, this is what I should do, even though maybe my context and demands environment are not the same.
And the age of the athlete depends as well. There might be times where, so for example, this year, the outdoor season is shortened because of the Olympics. So national championships, a lot of the meets are really condensed into a small period of time in the summer. Okay, for our older, higher performing level athletes, some of which have a shot at the Olympics, we need to be ready for nationals to try to qualify and get there. We have some first year athletes, as talented as they are, they're not going to be going to the Olympics. So you can make a decision. Is it worth rushing them into a short season? Or do we maybe just take the summer to emphasize training and getting better at the sport? And we will compete here or there, but we take the emphasis off of competition. Because now I'm sitting there going, okay, if you're a first year athlete, we have a really good opportunity to train and get better and build that base, which might actually serve you really well in second, third, and fourth year. As where if we're always just hyper focused on competition, we may not have that opportunity. So that's an example of a bit of a wrinkle in the schedule that sometimes you deal with, that, with an older, higher training age athlete, you probably want to skew towards the competition focus, because that's their, training to win or training to compete. But if you have a younger athlete that's still building and growing into the sport, you may put less emphasis on the competition and put more emphasis on training and establishing the base, because that might help them, moving forward with that as well. So that, I think, would be another thing to consider with the schedule. Is this a young, developing talent, or is this someone who needs to be ready to go right now, right away? Because that's going to influence what you focus on as well, I think.
You were talking about having people being either ready to go, or we're focusing on the training to train.
Mhm.
And I'm interested in, when we're thinking about those groups, so ready to go, they've got to perform, but also the training to train. I'm interested in practical applications for those kind of athletes, in terms of how would they decide, okay, now I'm going to focus on some jumps or some plyos. But also, one of the things we've obviously been focusing on is a lot of these sports where the actual jumping is important. So it's height, or it's being reactive. But you talked a little bit about cross country as well, where that's maybe not a sport where you'd think like, I need to jump, or I need to be fast off the ground in the same way, especially because the terrain can change.
Absolutely.
How would you recommend that these athletes decide how and when and why they're going to incorporate jump or plyometric training? So I know that's kind of a big question, because we're talking about being prepared to go versus training to train, versus these athletes that might even go, but why would I do that for myself in my sport?
So I think even if you don't, obviously if you are a high jumper or a long jumper, you need to jump, and that's your sport. And we've been talking a lot about volleyball, basketball. Those are very clearly jumping based sports. Volleyball especially, even more so than basketball probably. But there's still sports, like American football or soccer or rugby, where a lot more running, a little less kind of vertical jumping going on. But like you said, well, I don't really jump much in my sport, so why would I need to do that? Or like you said, something like cross country, if they need to jump, something's probably gone. Someone's fallen and they're hurtling over somebody, or whatever. The idea of jumping is sort of not going to happen in that sport. I still think there's benefit to jump or plyometric type training. Again, I say those separately because they're not the same thing. Because again, if we look at, well, what's the window of time you have to apply force, I think it just helps open up kind of the library, or expand the training toolbox, so to speak, of what you can pick from in order to be better at your sport. Because if the only thing I have is a barbell and heavy weights, really hard with a barbell and heavy weight, or even a bunch of machines or things like that, where there's no interaction with the ground, becomes really hard to emphasize training where you apply force in a really small period of time. If I have a bunch of classic weight room, number of machines, heavy barbells, things like that, I have all the tools and elements I need to do that big window of time training. That may not give me the small window of time force application, or the reactive or the bouncy part of training. So we can use different types of jumping and plyometric activities to address smaller contact times. Because with those sports that we talked about, even cross country, as much as it's a slow event, so to speak, in quotations, you're still on and off the ground relatively quickly. These athletes are still dealing with probably 2, 3, 4, 5 times body weight every time they strike the ground. And that would be the same thing in rugby or American football or soccer, anything like that, where athletes are running around. So a lot of times you still have elements in your sport where there's a brief contact period of time. So incorporating some of that jump training, plyometric training is great to build robustness in the tendons, in the joints, in the ligaments. So I might not be a high jumper or a long jumper or a volleyball player, but if I play rugby, for example, I still run around. I still have running technically is a plyometric movement. You are in flight, and then you have to land and react with the ground and then step again. So you may not think of yourself as a jumper, so to speak, but jump and plyometric type training can be really beneficial for running and contact sports to help build resiliency in the tendons and the joints, to keep people healthy, and then also improve performance with the movements and the actions where you need to produce a lot of force or power in a really small period of time. So I
Yeah.
still think it has benefit for those people.
No, sure. I think so too. And the robustness is one of the reasons that I personally actually do very small amounts of plyos always in the warm-up for athletes as well, because with some sports, so for example, when I'm working with beach volleyball in the pre-season phase, I do specific plyometric sessions with them in the week.
Yeah.
But then when we get into season, they're obviously jumping a lot anyway, and we also have less time to be on the training side rather than the competing side and the ball specific training. So for them, I often have in their sessions just little bits that they touch because they're on a harder surface then as well. So it's also totally different to when they're in their sand sessions, just from that robustness perspective, that giving them a little protection. And same thing when I'm working with my ice sport athletes, especially we see sometimes with short track speed skating, when they go from pre-season where they've only been cycling, they've maybe done some track and field, and then they've done the strength, and we go suddenly back to ice. That's when we sometimes see patella tendons react. And I just find doing some of the stuff like the plyos as well as the heavy loading and the strength sessions seems to mitigate some of that when they come back to ice as well.
Well, and I think the speed skating is a really interesting example too, because this has my brain now thinking with the cross country athletes that move from soft surfaces and then they go indoor into the track. And especially we have some individuals that, will compete cross country, which is 8 to 10 kilometers. And then when they move indoor, they're 600 or 800 meter runners. And I know 600, 800 seems like a long distance event relative to the 60 or the 100. These men and women are still ripping in the 6 and the 800. It's a fast event. If you've never seen it in person at a high level, they are moving. It is not slow at all. So the demands of this slower tempo running on soft, possibly even muddy and wet surfaces, which then really give, kind of similar to the sand and beach volleyball, now you end up in a much stiffer spike and shoe on a hard surface. So there are things that we can do where they might be in cross country season, but as we get closer to competing indoor, we start to put more reactive, faster contact time plyometrics in training. And they have a hop series that they do year round and things like that to help prepare them for that demand. And vice versa, we could do some longer plyometric work to help prepare them getting indoor after they're coming off of an outdoor season where, again, they're on a harder surface. So with speed skating, you can probably do much of the same where, okay, we're going to be getting back onto the ice. What are the demands they're dealing with? We can use plyometric or jump training to match the contact time or the force application windows to help prepare them for that. And I think back to the original use of plyometrics. That's what it was. It's cold, it's snowing outside. We can't high jump. We can't long jump. Well, how can we find a way in training to replicate and make those demands the same without actually doing that event? So that, to me, I think your example of the speed skaters really highlights, even if you're not a jumping athlete, which speed skaters are definitely not jumping athletes, they're on the ice skating around, that stuff can still benefit them though, even though they're not jumpers, so to speak.
Okay, so if someone is listening to this and they're an athlete themselves and they're going, okay, I think I want to incorporate some jump or some plyometric training into my training sessions, how would you recommend they start with this?
So I'm a big fan of introducing plyometrics via what I'll call like extensive plyometrics or longer periods of time, less intensity. So the emphasis is not on maximum height or maximum distance that you're covering on the jump, but it's more about, am I landing on the ball of the foot? Am I able to develop sort of a rhythm with the jumping? Something like skipping is a really, really good extensive plyometric. You could skip for 2-3 minutes and develop good rhythm, develop, ball of the foot contact, and do things like that without, stressing the system too much. And then you have things on the other end where if you're doing, if you're dropping off of a, 2-meter box and then jumping as high as you can, or doing these extreme, kind of plyometric movements, I generally will move people from the more gentle, extensive, rhythmic type plyometrics into the more intensive, a straight leg bound, alternating bounds, drop jumps for height, or, dropping off of a box onto another box, things like that. We will move in that direction. So if anyone's, I mean, if you Google, and there might be other terms out there, I'm speaking, I think, more athletics or track and field terms, but if you Google, extensive plyometrics, you'll find a lot of small amplitude, small hopping, repeating jumps, which are great things that you can start with. Small, some of them are in place, which is going to be easier than traveling forward or backwards, side to side. And then if you search up, intensive or, maximum plyometric movements, you'll find all the wild, dropping off of big heights and big jumps and things like that. So that's generally how it would work somebody into that, because the extensive stuff, the skipping, the small hops, when we talked about sort of developing resiliency in the tendons and things like that, that's a great place to start doing that type of stuff. And that's something with our athletes we actually do year round, regardless of the time of the year, because it's just beneficial and making the tendons more elastic and preparing them to do the things that they need to do in the bigger output, more maximal type of actions.
Yeah, this is exactly the kind of stuff I'm often integrating into the warm-ups. And I think one of the things you said that is maybe nice to just highlight, because again, when you don't have an idea about exercise prescription or concepts of loading, you maybe don't actually know what is the easier intro options versus what is the more intense. So one of the things you said was, if you're doing it in place rather than traveling, that's already going to scale it down a little. And one of the things that, I think a lot of athletes start off with when they haven't done this before, they start a lot of these jumps and they're like, oh, but it has to be as high as possible, or it has to be as fast as possible. And it's like, no, in the beginning, you're really just getting used to this. If it feels almost too easy, that's probably okay with a lot of these extensive ones.
Exactly. And so, yeah, you're talking, the extensive ones I like to start with. And then the intensive jumps are probably the next place you go, like a standing long jump or standing vertical jump, where you emphasize the maximum height or distance on the jump. And then the final element I would add in is that reactive, where you might be still emphasizing maximum distance or height, but now it's, repeated hurdle hops, for example, or dropping off of a box and jumping as high or as far forward as you can. So the general theme I would follow is more extensive, intensive, or maximal jumps, and then adding the reactive component, because then in theory, it doesn't always work this way, but in theory, if you have the extensive elements down, you have the rhythm, you have the foot contact, and then you combine it with the intensive work you've done, you have the maximal output. When you do things that are reactive, when you watch an athlete do a, hurdle hops or a bound flawlessly, those are individuals that have both the intensive and the extensive qualities of that movement. They have the output, but they also have the rhythm and the positions to do that as well. So that's kind of the general flow I would work with, like typically in my case with athletes that I'm working with. So if you've never done them before, that's kind of the ladder you could climb, so to speak, in terms of getting to where you want it to go.
Is there anything else that you feel like people should know about plyos or jump training?
Personally, my biggest pet peeve is when, the plyo and jump training kind of get used interchangeably. So I think kind of the first point, know that if you want to do this type of stuff, know the difference between jump training and plyometric, and not because, it's, oh, well, this is what it's called, so you need to call it that, but because they actually do very different things. If all I do is maximum height box jumping, and then I wonder why I'm not, able to run and touch the rim on a basketball court, or, why the person next to me on the volleyball court can get way over the net and deliver a spike and I can barely get over the net. It's because I've been doing more jump training rather than plyometric training. So that's, again, just one example of where the gap can be. So I think that would be one of the biggest things I could emphasize, is that there is a difference between jump and plyometric training. And the plyometric training has that reactive element where you land interact with the ground and then create force from that. So knowing the difference between jump and plyometric training, I think, is beneficial. Again, not from a, oh, you need to know this because, elitist strength conditioning, know your terms, whatever. We want to know the difference between these things because they will do different things. And one of my favorite sayings is pick the right tool for the job. And, in this case, to me, jump training is a saw and plyometrics are a hammer. Those are two different tools where if I try to use the saw like a hammer, it's probably not going to work very well. So yeah, I think that would be kind of a good kind of closing. Just know the difference between the two because it will help you select the right tool for the job to be better at whatever it is in training you're trying to, improve.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you let people know where they can find you, Tommy, if they want to know more about you?
Yeah. So if people want to kind of reach out or find me, I'm on Instagram's kind of the only social that I'm on. So I'm on Instagram at Speed Strength Performance. So if you want to see, I've not posted recently, but we got a little podcast that I do as well with a colleague of mine in athletics. So if you want to check out some of that, you can. If you want to see some of the content that's on there, or, feel free to DM me if you want to reach out or have a conversation. If there was something that, I said that sparked a thought or you had a further question about. So anyone can feel free to reach out to me there. So Speed Strength Performance on Instagram. And I'm always happy to interact and chat with, anybody who has a question or has an idea. I love learning from other people and having these types of conversations. So I'm always open to that type of stuff.
Nice. This is exactly why I organized the podcast as well, is because I really like learning in general and getting to learn from other people. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk.
No, I was happy to be here. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. And, always thankful for this opportunity. So yeah, hopefully it was a good one for the listeners and everybody was able to take something away. But yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Just a reminder that you can find further podcast episodes at www.siobhan-milner.com/podcast. And this is where you can also find different ways of working with me if you head to www.siobhan-milner.com. Enjoy.